Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll get started. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko, and I'm fortunate to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, the host for today's session. We're thrilled here at the Wilson Center, as many of you know, but I hasten to repeat, the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. We are about bringing the worlds of scholarship and research and analysis together with the worlds of policy and practitioner in a broad range of U.S. and U.S. and the world foreign policy and international policy issues. The Environmental Change and Security Program is, I think we're in our 14th year. We do that specifically with issues of environment, health, population, development, foreign policy, security policy. It's still a fairly big agenda, but one that we enjoy a great deal, and we are able to do, in the case of today's meeting, like many of our sessions, with the generous support from USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. So it's terrific to see a number of those folks here today. We're very pleased to have today's session. We noticed some months back, in part because we talked to these two gentlemen on a regular basis, but we noticed some months back that they were going to have two books coming out at about the same time, two books that we anticipated would be significant in the field, and so we thought we'd put them together and have a discussion that we've entitled, more or less, Two Accounts of Family Planning. I think both books go in a variety of directions, and there's some connections, and then there's some areas where they are on different territory. But we thought it would be an excellent way to bring an interesting group of people together and have a conversation with both Bob and Matt, two people who've been contributors and frequenters here at the Wilson Center for many years. So it's a pleasure to welcome them back. I'm just going to say very briefly a word about their bios, although we've handed them out, and I hope you can read in greater depth some of their experience. Matt Connelly is going to go first. Matt is associate professor at Columbia University, taught before Michigan, Sydney, and Paris as well. Number of books as a historian coming from a history perspective. And he's written Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population, that came out, I think, last month. Both books coming out last month. So Matt's going to kick us off. And then Bob Engelman, who is now Vice President for Programs at WorldWatch Institute here in town. Many of you will also know Bob was Vice President for Research at Population Action International, also here in town, working on connection to the Wilson Center, working on pop and environmental issues for many years, and we've engaged in dialogue. And Bob comes originally from a journalism background, and as I think you will hear and you will read when you get his book, is very effective in using stories to tell people's stories in the world, and particularly women's stories, but also draw larger points and make larger points. So it's a great pleasure to have Bob here as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Matt, and we'll have both presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A all at the end. So thank you very much for coming. And one procedural note, when we do get to Q&A, we're webcasting this, so I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to come and use the microphone and let us know who you are before you speak. All right, please, the floor is yours. Great. I can pull out to the side now if you'd like so you can see.
I just realized I needed a place for my notes, so looks stable.
Yes.
Okay.
Not sure they'll be able to see you, though.
All right. Maybe that's better.
Or
right?
the camera.
It's also a screen, you know. How's that? That doesn't work any better, does it? All right. The best laid plans. All right. Well, what do I mean, by putting up this title here, Less is More? Well, when Jeff was telling me, and I want to thank Jeff for inviting me, and for Gib Clark also for organizing all of this, and the Wilson Center for supporting my work in so many ways over the years. But when Jeff told me that he was going to title this panel, where Bob and I are both of us going to be talking about our books, he was going to call it More or Less, I thought, do I really want to be the one who's going to argue for less? Is that really what my position should be today? And that's why I decided that I was going to title my talk Less is More. Because what I mean by that is that the less we think about targeting populations, the less we think about controlling populations, the less we have a crisis mentality, the less we assume that all of our problems come from too many people, the more I think we can work on the things that really matter, like reproductive rights, reproductive health care. And so less population control, more reproductive freedom. But what do I mean when I, in the title of this book, called it Fatal Misconception? What I mean is the erroneous belief that political problems, whether poverty or violence or environmental degradation, have biological causes and technological solutions. Now, this book tries to show that you can't make people better by breeding them. Whether eugenic sterilization or paying poor people to stop having children, population control has not worked because people will not be controlled. And manipulative or coercive population programs have had the most pernicious consequences. Not the least is to undermine the cause of reproductive rights. And many thousands died from risky contraceptives and substandard reproductive health care. And millions were sterilized under the most appalling circumstances. Much of it paid for by the World Bank, the United Nations Population Fund, the Ford Foundation, International Planned Parenthood, and many other organizations in the field. And all of this enabled the Roman Catholic Church to rally conservative Muslims and evangelical Christians and mobilize a backlash against abortion and contraception worldwide. Now, it was only in the last quarter century that people working from within and without managed to reform organizations like Planned Parenthood and the UNFPA and redeem the cause of reproductive freedom. Now, I used to be one of those who assumed that population growth made poor countries even poorer and contributed to political unrest. Now, I co-authored an article about it back when I was still in graduate school. This is an article that I wrote together with my graduate school mentor, Paul Connelly, titled, "Must It Be the West Against the Rest?" And as you can see in this article, right on the cover, it says, "Whether it's a racist fantasy or realistic concern, it's a question that won't go away. As population and misery increase, will the wretched of the earth overwhelm the Western paradise?" And we call for more and better international aid, but especially more money for contraception. Now, like many people who grew up in the wake of Roe versus Wade, I did not feel any particular passion about reproductive rights. Now, the right to decide whether and when to have children seemed like settled law. Now, instead, I looked at population growth and migration in terms of national and international security. I was therefore unsettled by what I discovered when I started researching a book on the subject. And much to my chagrin, I found that many other authors to the left, the right, and the middle, had issued similar warnings decades ago. And many of them went on to advocate coercive measures to control population growth. And I think we were right about one thing. It's a question that won't go away. Worries about population growth and movement are proliferating. And I'm going to give you just a few examples from some recent bestsellers. Starting with Mark Stein's book, the radio personality, America Alone. Now, for Mark Stein, the decline of fertility in Western countries portends the decline of the West. Someday soon, he writes, you might wake up to the call to prayer from a muezzin. Europeans already are. The future belongs to the fecund and the confident, and the Islamists are both. While the West, wedded to a childlessness that consigns it to oblivion, is looking ever more like the ruins of a civilization. Now, for others, population growth is making the planet uninhabitable, even if poor people don't actually invade. Overpopulation turns them into terrorists. Now, Jared Diamond, for instance, whose politics couldn't be more different than Mark Stein's, he has a picture of the ruins of a civilization on the very cover of his more recent book, Collapse. Now, here's what he writes. Countries that are environmentally stressed, overpopulated, or both become at risk of getting politically stressed and of their governments collapsing. When people are desperate, undernourished, and without hope, they try to emigrate at any cost. They fight each other over land. They kill each other. They start civil wars. They figure that they have nothing to lose, So they become terrorists. Now, it's true that poor countries have long had high rates of fertility, and it has seemed obvious that this must be part of their problem, and that having fewer children is part of the solution. Now, in fact, it's not supported by the data. I use a lot of graphs in this book, more than my editor would have liked, but this was one that I was persuaded not to include. Now, if you find this confusing, you should, because it's a graph that represents, along the y-axis, you have GDP growth in all the countries of the world arranged in terms of how quickly their economies are growing at an annual rate, all the way down from -3% all the way up to 7% a year. Now, on the y-axis, you have population growth. That is how rapidly these countries are growing in terms of population. Now, if you don't see any pattern, it's because there is no pattern. Countries are all over the chart. Some countries with relatively high rates of population growth also grow quickly economically, and vice versa. Now, another idea is to reduce population growth in order to solve environmental problems. Now, the problem with this, if you actually look at the history of efforts to reduce fertility rates, if you want to see how it is that organizations like Planned Parenthood and the UNFPA and so on tried to persuade people to have smaller families, it was by trying to convince them, by showing them the miserable, poor, unplanned, unhappy, often violent and ugly family on the left, was one that, if only they had fewer children, would become the happy, rich, prosperous, good-looking, athletic, planned family on the right. It was really a miraculous transformation that was promised, and all if people would only have 2 children, or 3 perhaps. So in the case of Nigeria, for instance, you can see that even in Nigeria, people were promised a suburban home and a car in the garage. Now, there's a curious thing about promoting smaller families. Now, by promoting smaller families, and also by promoting different ways of thinking about family, it did, one might say, even if it wasn't these organizations who did it, over time, changes in attitudes about family size did reduce the rate of population growth for reasons I'm going to describe in a moment. But it also increased the numbers of households in which people live. The numbers of households, that is, the numbers of homes in which people live, is now increasing at twice the rate of world population. This shows you how, this is a study that was published in Science a couple of years ago about increase in numbers of households worldwide. And they tried to show how even in the case of New Zealand, even in the 9 districts where population was actually declining, the numbers of households was increasing. And in fact, and this is what you can see spread across the top part of this chart, the declines in population size actually coincided with increases in the numbers of households. And when you increase the numbers of households, if people live by 1s and 2s and 3s instead of in multi-generational larger households, people consume more of everything per capita, whether it's fuel or water or wide open spaces. So reducing the rate of population growth is not going to solve all of our environmental problems. Now, what about the notion that population growth fuels violence? Jared Diamond blames the Rwandan genocide on Rwanda's high population density. So too does Jeffrey Sachs in his new book, Commonwealth. A book, by the way, in which Jeffrey Sachs explicitly backs population control and uses the term population control. Now, it's true. Rwanda has had high population density. But I want you to compare Rwanda with this other country. This is another country that also has relatively high population density. Now, if you look at Rwanda on the left, you can see how it is that in those red parts of the country, you have from 500 to 1,000 or even more people living per kilometer. But if you look at the country on the right, you also see that there are many parts of the country where you have 500 to 1,000 or more people living per kilometer. So this is also one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Now, there are other ways in which these two countries are comparable. Like Rwanda, this country is ethnically divided. And this is a part of the world that has had many wars over religion and what many people would think of as religious fanaticism. And this has included horrendous massacres and persecution. And it eventually required the partition of this country from the territory to the north in a long war, a war that lasted some 9 years and drew in other neighboring states in the region. The country to the north is the country that we now call the Netherlands. And the country I'm talking about is Belgium. Now, it's true, the worst violence occurred in earlier centuries, in the 16th century and especially in the 19th century. But Belgium's population was much smaller then. Now, is Belgium overpopulated? Now, if someone suggested to you that Flemings and Walloons were going to start cutting each other's throats because they couldn't possibly inhabit such a tiny territory together, you would think they were crazy. And you would be right. Because political violence has complex causes. And it is not driven by demography. Now, if some countries are rich and others are poor, it usually has something to do with relations of power. You know, if Belgium had been a colony of Rwanda, for instance, rather than the other way around, then I would suggest that things might have been rather different, even if the population density wasn't very different. And what I'm trying to suggest is that even sophisticated quantitative research, and there's a lot of very unsophisticated quantitative research in this field, even the most sophisticated quantitative research can't answer the questions that really come down to values. How we value human life, how we understand the good life, and how we choose to live with one another, or prefer not to live with one another. Now, if you worry about poverty, or environmental degradation, or genocide, then you have to address these problems head on. And you can't make them go away just by making other people go away. Now, for an extreme example of this way of thinking, you might consider another bestseller. This is Alan Weissman's The World Without Us. This was a book, if you look on the right, it inspired an article in Slate about global swarming, suggesting that maybe it was time for Americans to start cutting their baby emissions. I like to show it alongside this illustration on the left. This is a very different perspective from the American conservative about the baby gap. How after the 2004 election, it was assumed that because Republicans and evangelicals had higher rates of fertility, that they were destined to rule. And that miserable, unhappy, decadent family, even if they might be rich, living in those blue states in the Northeast, like me, that they were doomed to irrelevance. So I'm trying to show you how it is that people have a different reaction that sometimes comes down to, again, how they evaluate the good life. But in the case of this particular book, let's have a look at Alan Weissman's book. This is a kind of environmentalist utopia. Why is it a utopia? Because it imagines a perfect world, perfect because it has no people. There's no people in Alan Weissman's world. That's why it's so appropriate for Earth Day. Now, Weissman wants to get us started. And here's what he says. Worldwide, every 4 days, human population rises by 1 million. Now, since we can't really grasp such numbers, they'll wax out of control until they crash. Now, the intelligent solution would henceforth limit every human female on Earth capable of bearing children to 1. And notice, he doesn't say anything about men. Presumably, men can have as many children with as many women as they want, which I think is telling. But we could debate, whether, for instance, the world would really be better off without any aunts and uncles, or brothers and sisters, or better yet, with nobody at all. But before embarking on a global one-child policy, shouldn't we look at places where they've already tried to limit people to only one child? China, the largest country in the world, has had a national policy to limit women to one birth for 30 years. And they've done this through birth permits and compulsory sterilization and coercive abortions. And this has led to extremely bitter resistance. Because without any social security system, Chinese depend on sons to provide for them in old age. This peaked in 1983, when China carried out some 20 million sterilizations in a single year. The next year, in recognition, the United Nations awarded the director of China's program, the hardest of the hardliners, mind you, a gold medal and a cash prize. Now, if you think that the United Nations was giving China a prize because it was promoting and protecting reproductive rights in 1984, then you're more Orwellian than I am. Now, China did finally manage to get its fertility rate down to 1.7. Now, alas, relatively few of those babies are girls, to the point that boys in some parts of China outnumber girls by almost 40%. Now, there are some who would say that it might be worth the cost, that 400 million fewer Chinese have left the world better off. But I want you to have a look at this graph. Now, if you look on the left, that is the left of the dotted line, you can see those countries that were assessed by people working in the population field as having a high program effort. That is, these were countries that were really trying to control fertility rates. And you could see the highest program effort score of all was given to China. And China did, it's true, reduce the fertility rate from some 6 children in 1950, 1955 to 1.7 in 2000, 2005. You also see significant drop-offs in India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But have a look at the countries to the right. These are the countries with the lowest program effort scores, or at least in the category with the lowest program effort scores, and the largest countries in that category. And they included Brazil and Turkey and Argentina, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia. Notice their fertility rates and how they changed over the same period. Now, what did the countries on the left do to get that high program effort score? They paid people to be sterilized, and in some cases punished them if they refused. And the population control programs in all these countries received international support. In some cases, like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Indonesia, at times international aid paid for 2/3 or more of the program budget. But again, these other countries, in many cases, had no program whatsoever. And still people found the means because it was important to them to control their family size. Now, far more important than population control in controlling the population of the world is something very simple and very stubborn. It's whether women actually want to have smaller families. And the most important predictor is whether women have access to education. All of the countries you see here that still have fertility rates of over 3 children per woman are also countries with very high rates of female illiteracy. So India in 1990, in the middle of this period, had 60% illiteracy, Pakistan 79%, Bangladesh 77%, and Saudi Arabia half of women were illiterate. Now I wish I could show you how this works worldwide, but this next graph did not come through. But if you have a look in the conclusion of my book, you can see how it is that the fall-off in female illiteracy is almost exactly correlated with the global decline in fertility rates. And women who do not have access to education or career opportunities tend to have large families. Now, this is not new information. It has been known for almost a century. The best way to bring down the birth rates was to allow more girls to go to school. But all along, the people that I write about did not see this as a solution. In fact, it was a problem. They worried that educated women were not contributing to the gene pool. So to bring down birth rates, they resorted to increasingly blunt instruments. Now, if simple people did not plan their families in ways that experts found intelligible, then researchers had to come up with simpler methods. If people were too poor to afford them, they could be paid for using them, with group pressure providing added inducement. And when many people would not accept IUDs or sterilization or implants or injectables, population controllers dreamed of something that could be added to the water or sprayed through the air, making everyone sterile without an antidote that only authorities could provide. I kid you not, this was actually research that was supported by the Ford Foundation and backed by the Population Council. Now, when no such technological fix was forthcoming, they denied maternity leave, housing, and health care, or simply dragged people to abortion and sterilization clinics, and camps like this one. Now, in this case, for instance, from Kerala, this is, in this case, a camp in which they had 50 beds in a vast operating theater, one that had been set up temporarily, and they were able to carry out some 60,000 sterilizations in a month. And this was promoted as a model for the rest of India. Now, by the emergency period in India, in a single year, in 1976, the bicentennial, Indira Gandhi's government sterilized people at the rate of 1 million a month. And when the World Bank and International Planned Parenthood Federation received word that these measures had provoked resistance, leading to clashes with the army and police, they redoubled their support. They increased their funding. Robert McNamara flew in to offer his support and said he wanted to commend India for finally getting serious in dealing with its population problems. McNamara was the president of the World Bank. Now, the family planning field is completely and utterly transformed. But I would argue that it was a long, hard slog. It took a long time to change these programs and to change these institutions. It was only in the late 1970s and in the 1980s that the major organizations in the field, the ones I've been talking about, the UN Population Fund, the Ford Foundation, Population Council, began to promote family planning as not just a strategy and a slogan for population control. Now, one reason is that until then, these organizations were almost completely dominated by men. The handful of professional women were almost completely shut out of the major policy decisions. In the 1980s, working both from within and without, they began to advance a broader agenda for reproductive rights and health. But the legacy of crash programs to reduce fertility was to make many people mistrust sexual and reproductive health care. And decades of warnings about a population bomb made it more difficult to sustain support for reproductive health care when it was not the fate of the earth, but the lives of individual women and children that hung in the balance. Now, this history still weighs like a millstone around the necks of the reproductive rights movement. But the main reason is simply that they have not unburdened themselves of it. They prefer to think, many prefer to think, especially people of this older generation who are more invested in this history, they prefer to think that these organizations have always and everywhere been dedicated to reproductive rights. Now, it's only by acknowledging how difficult it was to reform these organizations that we can put to rest once and for all the accusation that they are still pursuing the same hidden agenda. Now, nowadays, anyone writing on these issues is expected to identify themselves as pro-life or pro-choice. These two camps seem locked in confrontation, espousing principles that have come to seem irreconcilable. But this is a history of how some people systematically devalued both the sanctity of life and the autonomy of the individual. Now, because I am late to this fight, this book reflects the passions of a convert, but not to one camp or the other, but rather to the belief that we must make common cause if we're to stop what may be the even more dangerous experiments of the future. Now, if history is any guide, I think that projections of population decline, even a population implosion, may lead to increasingly coercive policies, perhaps even crash programs. But in this case, to try to get women to have more children rather than fewer. And if you think that family planning has to be justified as just a means to that end of controlling fertility rates, then on what principle can you stand in the way of those who would use them, deny family planning, even deny women access to education and employment as a way to boost fertility rates? Now, there's also the prospect that sex-selective abortion will make women a persecuted minority in parts of Asia. And with genetic enhancement, so-called, the most privileged people may try to make themselves a breed apart. Now, there is already an almost completely unregulated market in sperm, eggs, embryos, and even infants, with the outsourcing of surrogacy and international adoption. And the cumulative effect of these individual choices may be to make patriarchy permanent in the largest nations and endow the most privileged with genetic advantages they will lord over the world. So I'd like to call for what I call a peace process for the abortion wars. It may seem naive, but I think it's actually possible that people of good faith on both sides might actually recognize some common threats and work together in addressing them. And this is how I'm going to conclude. I think that there are people on both sides, even among many otherwise pro-life congressmen, recognition that universal access to birth control is the best way to reduce rates of abortion. They might also, some people anyway, would also, I think, agree to try to campaign to end sex-selective abortion. If there's anywhere in the world that I'd actually like to see abortion clinic protesters, it would be standing in front of those places where people are using ultrasounds to avoid having daughters. I would also like to see free and equal access to infertility treatment. If this is really a part of the Cairo Consensus, if everyone agrees that this is part of comprehensive reproductive health care, then why is it so rarely provided in family planning clinics? And why is it almost never a priority for population organizations in this field? Now, if people are to be permitted to use new technologies for genetic enhancement, then I think they have to be available to everyone equally. And finally, I think in the field of international adoption, now anarchic and inequitable, I think it is a field that's ripe for advocacy and reform. Now, certainly on issues like this one, and many of the others too, I don't see why pro-life and pro-choice people necessarily have to disagree. And I think there are many opportunities they might actually work together. The struggle against population control has shown that it is never enough merely to insist on choice. Choices can be, have been, conditioned and constrained by default or design in ways that lead to new kinds of oppression. And the defense of life can also become a symbol devoid of substance, if the effect is to drive people to breed. Reproductive freedom is a cause that can and must stand on its own, now more than ever. But it can only take flight if it is animated by a vision of social justice, in which every one of us is conceived in liberty and created equal. So I thank you for your time, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt and I were bonding over a bite to eat before this session, and I'm really hoping that means he's not going to put my book on his next PowerPoint. Thanks, Jeff and the staff of the Environmental Change and Security Program, and especially Gib Clark for organizing this event. I have to admit I was a little skeptical of the format at first, doing this double feature of two books, but I'm having fun so far. So it's okay, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. You'll all be acknowledged in the sequel to my book, More and More. I want to also say a special word about Amy Cohen and Population Action International for the incredible support they offered me really over 15 years of working there, and especially in the last few working on this book. Thanks a lot, Amy, and thanks a lot to my great colleagues from PAI, a few of whom are here, and I appreciate that. I'm going to acknowledge Matt Connelly in my sequel as well, because I really wish I'd had his book to read when I was working on my research. Matt and I share a fascination with this topic, population, and what people try to do to influence. Now as in the past, it's a pretty interesting topic, and as they say in the newspaper business, it's really a hell of a story. And I think Matt's book brings that out, and I try to in mine. I was struck in reading Fatal Misconception that we make some of the same points, and we even tell some of the same stories. And darn it, his book came out first. But that's just kind of the way it goes. We both argue, for example, that most attempts to control population have in fact forced women to have more children than they wanted to have, not fewer. We both have pretty harsh assessments of certain actions of the Catholic Church. We both describe the sexual inventiveness that allowed the French to reduce their fertility way back in the 18th century. And we both mention the two famous eugenics enthusiasts with whom birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger had affairs in the 19-teens. We present a similar cast of characters, though I have a lot fewer of them, since I had one chapter in my book that covers the material that Matt did in nearly 400 pages. One thing I like about Matt's book is that he lays out his premises and his values clearly and early. I think that's important in a book, particularly one dealing with a topic as complicated as this one. In my own, I tried to state my hypothesis on the very first page, and I recapitulate it more fully on the very last page. I'm not going to share the end of the book. I wouldn't deny you that pleasure. But what I say on the first page is that years ago, I was a newspaper reporter here in Washington. I was covering science, health, and the environment. And I happened to meet a woman named Sharon Camp, who worked at the time for something then called the Population Crisis Committee. And I'm sure a number of people in the room know Sharon well. And she happened to suggest to me that if all the world's women could decide for themselves when and when not to have children, population problems would resolve themselves with no need for government control. And this was about 4 or 5 years before the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. So I was a journalist at the time, and I was a little bit skeptical of that. I had a lot to learn about this field, but I really wondered whether that could possibly be true. But it struck me as a rare and really interesting, plausible hope in the midst of what I was writing about is a considerable gathering of environmental risk going on in the world. And what Sharon was telling me was that a conviction that I share with Matt, which is that people should determine for themselves when and when not to have children, might in fact be on its own the greatest guarantor and source that population change could be a positive force for the environment and for human well-being generally, particularly when women are the decision makers who are really making the key decisions on this. Because, after all, women are the child bearers, all of the child bearers, last time I checked the data, and the principal child raisers, and in the words of one Bolivian woman I quote, they approach the door of death every time they give birth. And I wanted to get at the heart of the differences between men and women when it comes to reproduction, reproductive intention, reproductive timing, population, and the impacts of all of these that have played out in history. So mine is a book about population growth, why it has happened, what have been its impacts, how it might continue to slow down and eventually end and even reverse now that it's no longer particularly helpful and instead a source of risk. The book is also about nature, because natural constraints have interacted with population growth ever since the species emerged. And because, frankly, our relationship with the natural world is especially worrisome right now. Happy Earth Day, by the way. Finally, it's a book about women because women are continually, forever on the front lines of population change. All populations, and this is another area where I agree with Matt, all populations are out of control. There's no hope. They always will be. But women, in the words of one of my chapter titles, are the original population growers when that's what we needed to survive as a species. And for later humanity, the population shrinkers. And when they're allowed to manage their own reproductive timing, I try to argue in this book, I suggest in this book, they're the nearest we have to true population controllers, and that's exactly as it should be. But there's a lot of caveats and limitations in that statement. In large part, this too is a historical book, but since my own training has been in journalism, the book leans much more in that direction. So I felt free to explore in the research and writing just sort of a suite of ideas and hypotheses that I find intriguing, without necessarily settling the matter in any particular case or feeling that I had to convince readers to believe something they didn't previously believe. And that was somewhat liberating. It allowed me to just really look at a lot of interesting things and see where they led me. And they led me to some places that really interested me. I wanted to tell compelling stories. I wanted to share the words of some women and some men in history, and others with whom I'd spoken with over the years about sexuality, contraception, and childbearing. I wanted to write a book about population, the environment, and women's lives that was just simply a good read, and that also broadened the audience for the message that had so excited and energized me that I'd heard from Sharon Camp way back around 1990. When people ask me the audience that I'm hoping for this book, my answer is beach readers. When you come back from Rehoboth in August, you can tell me whether I had any luck at this. And it's a hard sell, but hope springs eternal. My historical range is pretty wide, starting about 6 million years ago with the emergence of bipedalism in human beings. Demographers know that it's not fertility ultimately that grows populations, but the survival of third children are a big theme in my book, and of course fourth and fifth, but I kind of lump them all together as third children, that really determines whether populations are going to grow. And it was really a series of innovations that can be pretty securely credited more to women than to men, that guaranteed that enough third children would survive and grow to their own parenthood, that sufficient proportions of first Homo erectus, one of our ancestral species, and eventually Homo sapiens, grew their populations. And again, we can all be very thankful for this, particularly here in Washington, which is far from where the species originated, that they eventually left Africa and they migrated and they spread all over the world. So I'm going to leave this. I've gotten very fond of this little mascot. I don't fully understand what it means, but it's on the cover of my book. Whoops, wrong direction entirely. Let's try. That's funny. That's not. Yeah, 5. I normally don't have any trouble with PowerPoint.
It's working now.
Okay. Let's see. This is one of the sort of the little things that I take a look at to try to make sense of in this book in terms of really looking at history, looking at prehistory, and trying to first answer the question, why did we grow in the first place, and who was most responsible? It really wasn't until women kind of entered the field of anthropology and really flooded graduate schools around the time, frankly, that I was just going to college and graduate school, that ideas about these things really began to change from sort of the man of the hunter, sort of supplying everybody with food, to other things that were happening. And this was one of the more interesting ones that I discovered. This particular illustration is based on the work of Wenda Trevathan and Karen Rosenberg, who are anthropologists. And they were really looking at how becoming bipedal and standing up on 2 feet actually changed the birth process, and paradoxically and somewhat unintuitively made it much, much, much more dangerous. It's the nature of the change of the pelvic structure in a woman's body that requires that what used to be a very simple act, that in a birth the mother of a 4-footed animal particularly just simply can reach down, grab the newly emerging newborn and bring it up to her breast and begin breastfeeding. But that couldn't happen in humans because of the natural positioning of the body, of the baby's body as it leaves the birth canal, because of the position of the pelvis. It's too much to go into much detail at the moment. But if you think about almost all mammals, including your kitty cats and your dogs that you've had, that always seek total isolation. They disappear into the garage or the basement or who knows where when they give birth. Humans couldn't do that, or bipedalism never would have survived. And one of the first things that women had to do once they were standing on 2 feet was go against this instinct from long evolution and ask for help. And this was a really remarkable thing. It may have had an influence on language, because after all, how did they ask? But it certainly had an influence on relations that women developed around this critical business of getting human beings through the most dangerous instant of life, and then beginning a partnership. It's called alloparenting technically, which is sort of a cooperative arrangement about parenting and mothering to bring them to their own survival. It just became sort of an emblem for the fact that women were very much engaged in this. It was really the beginning of midwifery, which I argue, I don't know why I keep going to this slide that I don't want. Whose fault is this? Blame it on Vista. We blame everything else on Vista. I'm going to probably have to go through these individually. This was really the beginning of midwifery, and I argue that midwifery has the best claim to be the oldest profession, and in fact that reproductive health may well be the oldest form of health care, which right away is interesting. And we could say, well, men could have been doing this too. How do we know it's women? Except that in almost all populations studied in cultures, it has been primarily a woman's role to assist in birth, and there's artistic representations of this. I'm envious that Matt got to put in his book illustrations. Island Press wouldn't let me do that in mine, so I get to show you the illustrations I would have put in more if I'd been able to. This is one of my favorite ones because it's just characteristic. Here are the guys. They're the astrologers. It's like they're looking out the window while the birth is happening. They say, I think Saturn is just about to go into conjunction with Jupiter. There could be good. And the women, the women are doing the hard-slogging work with equipment, with the water, and making sure that the baby is actually being born. And that was the way it worked through much of history until fairly regular in history. Let's see if this is going to work. Good. We'll go back to the ladybug. One of the themes of Moore is that population is a constant in human thought, and in fact predates human thought by millions of years. all organisms are acutely aware of their group size, and many are pretty strict about it, a lot stricter than people are, even in some of Matt's stories. You'll never see a flying V of migrating geese and be able to count more than about 24 birds. And the increase in typical group size among humans is among the more distinctive aspects of the species and our own evolution. We started writing about our numbers pretty much as soon as we started writing, and we've kept at it ever since. I suspect a lot of people here in the room read yesterday reporter Blaine Harden's article in the Washington Post that was headlined, "Population Pressures, Birth Rates Help Keep Filipinos in Poverty." Well, without either agreeing or disagreeing with that thesis, the point that I make is that the issue is never going to go away. It's just too basic to who we are. And I recall when I worked at PAI, often getting in discussions with various groups who worked on reproductive health and said, we just really don't want to deal with population. We don't feel it's necessary. And I often said in response, I wish at PAI we had that luxury. We get calls from reporters. They are interested in population. It's just an issue that's never going to go away. And particularly lately, it is again perking up. And whatever you think of it, it's not surprising that it would perk up again. But just as we change our populations, our population changes change us. I found it fascinating as I worked on this book how much new research, often by women, is supporting the importance of population growth as a shaper of interactions between natural resources and human well-being, and even as a direct force in cultural evolution. Contemporary historians, probably not Matt, but a lot of contemporary historians are using the adjective, for example, Malthusian, suddenly or recently, to describe dynamics between historic natural resource scarcity, technological innovation, and population change. Some archaeologists are now arguing that ups and downs of human population numbers in prehistory are the best single explanation for why things like body decoration, art, and language flowered at certain times and not at others. One chapter in my book explores what's known as the axial age. It's not a theme that I was very familiar with before I worked on the book, which is an area of around few centuries that sort of center on 500 BC. 500 BC was a time that Socrates was doing his thing in Athens, and Confucius was active. The Buddha was meditating in northern India, southern Nepal. Taoism was being founded. A lot was going on. There was a real ferment in societies. And there were also very dramatic changes across all the societies of Europe and Asia in the nature of rulers and the nature of religions, and particularly in gender relations. It was an area of almost universal subjugation of women. And these parallel developments may reflect, and I'm just hypothesizing, population growth and environmental degradation after the Iron Age began. Copper and tin were the essential resources of the Bronze Age, which came before the Iron Age. That's what bronze is, copper and tin. And interestingly, outcrops of both of these metals are kind of rare to begin with. They didn't crop up in very many parts of Europe and Asia, so they were sort of rare. And they got rarer as the Bronze Age began. As a matter of fact, around 1300 BC, there was apparently a period of what we could call peak tin. And it really just started to run out altogether. Who knows, maybe because of population growth and overconsumption, I'm not sure, worked together to really cause this to get scarce. But the good news, since when the tough gets going, the tough get patents, or the equivalent in prehistory, that iron ore was scattered pretty much everywhere. Iron ore is very, very common in the ground all over the world. And once we had the technology to burn wood hot enough to smelt iron, suddenly we could produce and make plows, axes, swords, and everything kind of went into overdrive. Forests were leveled, food surpluses began, at least for a while, until population growth caught up. All of these things interacting together to probably have an impact on why the axial age happened. I spend large parts of several chapters exploring the idea that women in these times and before and afterwards have always sought or wanted the ability to time their reproduction. I have to admit, part of that on my part is I'm not a woman, obviously, but part of it just seems logical to me. Women were engaged in gathering. They got to know plants extremely well. They may have had some involvement in hallucinogens. There's a lot of thought that early human art was based on a knowledge of hallucinogens and was made literally under the influence. It just seems logical, especially because women probably got it a little bit before men did, what this connection was between sexual intercourse and then becoming pregnant a little later, that they might have thought at certain points in history, maybe at a lot of points in history, gee, is there some way I could be having sex with some other guy at some other time and have a baby, but not with this guy right now? It just seems logical to me. And in fact, when I looked at that as a question, I found that there was a lot of evidence that that was indeed true, that women were both trying to time pregnancy all over history, and in fact potentially having some success at this, including delaying first births well before the age of contraception. And that even it's possible, and this is really intriguing to me, that their efforts in this regard actually influence past demographic trends. Now, there's not much documentation of ancient contraception, but then there's not much documentation of anything involving the lives of women before recorded history. But what can be found is pretty fascinating. There's a wealth of medical literature on contraception and abortion, most of it admittedly written by men, in Greek and Arabic literature. There are instructions to priests in the 9th century kingdom of Lotharingia in north central Europe. This is not far from Belgium. Luxembourg. This was a very, very densely populated piece of Europe at that time, for that time, and food scarcity was a constant problem for people living there, in which priests were basically counseled on how to stop their parishioners from practicing withdrawal to postpone pregnancy. There's a 14th century account by a woman of her own affair with a priest on the border between Spain and France. And together they used an herbal pessary, which she describes, which from the description has been guessed at or analyzed to probably have been an ancient amenagogue. Now, that's a word that I didn't know before I started working on this book, and it's a word I guarantee you're never going to see in a spelling bee or on an SAT exam. Because what an amenagogue is it's a substance that induces immediate menstruation. Well, why would anybody want to do that? Because it gets rid of any evidence that you might have been or might have been about to be pregnant. If you're a woman, you don't need to know about it, and nobody else needs to know about it. And there's a certain elegance to the way amenagogues operate that makes it much easier to imagine natural substances being amenagogues than actual acting as kind of birth control pills. And all the more so pessaries, because they provide a physical obstacle to conception in addition to just something that would be chemical or hormonal or something you take in the body. So through all of this wanders this interesting figure of the midwife. Now, midwives are obviously about helping to bring on healthy births, and that's what most people associate with them, and that's most obviously of what they do even today. But midwives have always been with women, that's what the word means, when they're giving birth, and often a woman's first question is, how do I prevent the next one? That's not a man's first question, but it's very frequently a woman's first question. A man's first perspective, as I quote in the book, an Irish male friend of mine said, what's the first thing a baby does on being born? This is a man's question. Cry? Breathe, I don't know, get spanked. No, makes room for the next one. That's the way guys, none the worse for wear, often tend to think about these things. Women are asking questions about timing. And timing is really more important in so many ways than this idea of limiting that's pervaded this field so much. I mean, I think timing is limiting, but the real question is women don't really want to have a certain desired fertility size the way DHS studies, I think, tend to kind of assume. What women have, in fact, is one pregnancy at a time in changing circumstances and often with changing partners. So midwives are all about this, and they're also about contraception. And as Socrates, the son of a midwife, notes in one of Plato's dialogues, they're often providers of abortions. So were there times and places where this was actually functioning in a way that actually provided for fairly stable populations and even maybe environmentally sustainable populations in history? Did women actually manage their own reproductive timing so effectively that this could happen? Well, it's impossible to know, and you could argue it's not likely. Even in the United States, with our presumably pretty sophisticated healthcare system, a pretty steady 45% or more of pregnancies are not welcome at the time that they announce themselves to women. So we can't expect that women did much better in the days before modern contraception. Still, you get glimpses of hunter-gatherer societies that were very stable in their populations over time and were probably using breastfeeding to keep family size quite low. World population itself was remarkably stable from pretty much the height of the Roman Empire all the way until the Norman conquest, pretty much the whole first millennium. There are around 300 million people, same population we have in the United States right now, by the best estimates. And there were 200 years or more after the Black Death ended in the 14th century when populations in most European countries did not rebound. And there wasn't any more plague or anthrax, and nobody's quite sure why. But I'll say something about that in a second. More in a more documented way, there was a total stasis of population in Tokugawa shogunate, Japan, the late 18th century of Japan. And in this case, the dominant cause, because Japan had good records at the time, was family size that was around 2 children per family. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, good. See if I can do this now. So in terms of this European population stasis that happened for a couple centuries after the plague, the Black Death, was over, it's interesting to speculate, and some have, that part of the whole witchcraft hysteria was around the idea, as the Catholic Church became more and more both powerful, influential with European governments themselves were allying with the nascent mercantile movement, which needed customers, traders, sailors, soldiers. This was a very vibrant period of European history. There were good reasons, and I quote a lot of the philosophers and the writers at the time, to be very concerned about static populations. And there were good reasons to be aware that contraception was happening in spite of the teachings of the Church, and I go on at some length about that as well. And it's an interesting speculation, and just that part of the witchcraft hysteria was out of concern that, in fact, midwives, who were probably disproportionately, and certainly older women were disproportionately executed in the witchcraft hysteria, were the wise women that were teaching ancient wisdom about how to postpone or prevent a pregnancy and childbearing. And although we can't prove that's the case, certainly the very primer of the witchcraft hysteria, this book, The Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch's Hammer, that was published in 1496 and disseminated with the printing press all over the world, talks specifically about this idea of witch midwives who stop birth from happening. And the other thing I want to, I don't even want to show that slide. That was one that I rejected. It's really a shame that I can't do this, because one of the things I really want to show you, because I couldn't in the book, although I describe it in the book, is this. 10 minutes remaining. Did this come from you? I actually have this much time.
I want to see grace under pressure.
This is good. Maybe I better just show this one slide. I have this broken down into several slides because it's really gripping. This is a propaganda scroll from late 18th century Japan, and I owe this to Fabian Drixler, who was a student of mine at Yale some years ago and provided this to me. He's doing his doctorate on this fertility governmental interaction in the late 18th century Japan. And this was the work of a society, of a government, a municipal government in this particular case in northern Japan, that was very concerned about the small size of Japanese families. Now, as it happens, there's good evidence that the way Japanese women were successfully able to maintain families of about 2 children for decades in late 18th century Japan was not through using IUDs and contraceptive pills, or from using natural contraceptives, which don't seem to have been very available to them. They had a clear unmet need for modern contraception. The dominant means of controlling their family size appears to have been infanticide, which is not by any means a pretty picture. One of the points I make in the book is that even regardless of our moral view of infanticide, it's a completely bonkers reproductive strategy. You have to go to all the trouble of going through pregnancy and then undergoing the risk of birth when you know you don't want to have a child. Women do not use infanticide, although it's been used a lot in history, because they have that option. They use it because they don't have options. But regardless of that, this particular scroll, and you've got, where's my little, I'll just show this one. I wish I could show it in more detail, but hopefully you can see it. You've got these Shinto and Buddhist deities overlooking a scene right here where a woman is throttling her baby while the midwife shakes out the mat, and the dad over here, or the would-be dad, would-have-been dad, is nonchalantly brewing tea. And then in punishment for this, remember this is a propaganda poster, not an illustration of sort of everyday life in Tokugawa, Japan, then the woman is sort of thrown down into hell, where she's shown the infanticide in a magic mirror, and then dropped upside down into a burning cauldron while babies that have been dispatched, and other women have obviously done the same thing, bathe in a pool of blood. It's pretty gross. But what's really interesting, oh, here it is. Yeah, amazing, I can do it. So this is the first scene. This is her going into hell. This is her the magic mirror, and this is her dropping into this cauldron. But what's really interesting is how effective this was. This was a really, talk about population-related propaganda. This was extremely effective population propaganda. In this particular community, which was fairly large, fertility immediately doubled within a few decades. And by 1920s Japan, it had tripled. So it's all by way of showing, again, this point that I made early on, that population control can work in both directions. And historically, I think there's a very, very good argument that it's worked more in this direction, getting women to have more children than they really wanted. You go ahead and fade. I guess that's part of the deal here. That may be almost through anyway. This disaffection for reproductive timing and slow population growth, which I argue work together very frequently in societies, hardly ended with the fading of witch hysteria or with the end of this particular era of Japanese history. Until the Supreme Court ruling in Griswold versus Connecticut, which I bet a few people in this room, including myself, are old enough to remember, in 1965, it was illegal for a married couple to use contraception in a number of localities in the United States, including, incidentally, right here in Washington, D.C. Wasn't enforced much in Washington, D.C. It was occasionally enforced in Connecticut. It was a criminal offense. And when our current president's father, George H.W. Bush, was a Texas congressman in the late 1960s, he was derided by a colleague with the nickname Rubbers because he spoke out to make family planning available to people who wanted it abroad. And then George H.W. Bush had to erase his own history when he became the running mate of Ronald Reagan, vice presidential running mate of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Even today, I think most of us here are aware that there are plenty of policymakers and quite a few writers who frankly believe that contraception is all too easy to access and to use, and that it's a big problem that women aren't having enough, producing enough babies as a result. Well, let me try to wind this up. I wonder if I can maybe go no signal. It probably means I'm not going to have any luck. That's okay. I had a slide that showed two people whom Matthew and I both write a fair amount about Robert Malthus, and I'm trying to remove this guy's initial name because he never went by Thomas. Robert Bob Malthus, his students actually called him Pop, which I like, Pop for population, Malthus, and Margaret Sanger. And then one in the middle of the slide you can't see because I think I've run out of batteries here, which is good. Mary Wollstonecraft, who's not nearly as well known, but who was sort of an original bridge writer. She was a contemporary of Malthus's, and she wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was a prolific writer, and was the first that I was able to document who made the point that if women could simply breastfeed the way women naturally want to breastfeed when their lives allow them to, they wouldn't have large families because, in fact, frequent active breastfeeding to the response of your baby or your child, it turns out is a pretty effective contraception, one that women knew about and talked about among themselves for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but was really only occasionally written up by men and was documented by Mary Wollstonecraft. And there's a sad story there in that when she was giving birth to her second child, she fell ill with puerperal fever. It was a fairly common reproductive tract fever in those days called childbed fever. And she died shortly after the birth, and she wanted to breastfeed her baby. But the doctor was concerned that her baby would get this fever. It wouldn't have been likely, but her doctor actually procured puppies to draw off the milk. That baby miraculously survived motherlessness. That wasn't easy in those days, as it hasn't been easy for much of history, and became Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. So just one of these sad, poignant stories about the way history sometimes works. Her husband, William Godwin, was a good friend of her, not a good friend, but a writer that Malthus admired, and Malthus actually put his name into the subtitle of his first essay. But Malthus apparently never read Wollstonecraft, had no awareness of her at all, and he certainly didn't know, would have been helpful to his arguments, that even though he was the father of 3 children, that breastfeeding was a good contraceptive. Malthus talked about contraception as just pure viciousness and vice. Just wickedness with regard to women was the phrase that he used. Well, I spent, as I say, some time writing about Malthus and about Sanger, and I quote a few things that both of them wrote that are very painful to read today. But I did this, I think, and I look at some of the things like the flirtation of Sanger and others in the movement, and with more than a flirtation. I don't want to demean it, especially with Matt here, with eugenics. I do think eugenics was quite a bit different than family planning and birth control, and I try to draw out what some of those differences were, but there's no doubt that there was that alliance going on, which I think was misguided. Obviously, I would. But I spent the time with both of them. I did a little mini biographies of them, in part because I think that the world owes them both a certain debt, a certain gratitude, quite frankly. And that the way that most governments and many dedicated individuals have approached population and family planning for the past few decades owes something to those 2 individuals and many others like them, and primarily has been a plus for the world, a plus for society in multiple ways. As in any human endeavor, there are mistakes all around international family planning. It had to learn something entirely new, entirely revolutionary in many ways, worldwide, globally, kind of at every step as it went along the way. And it doesn't surprise me at all that it made some horrendous errors along the way. A lot of learning had to go on. A lot of people could have been more competent. Could have been more empathetic. I think this is probably classic in a lot of human endeavors, and they probably could have been a lot less full of themselves. But there's no doubt, there's really no doubt that the deaths that occurred, the deaths that have occurred in quantity, have been much more in the realm not of societies that organize population and family planning programs, but in those that have discouraged, stigmatized, and banned contraception and abortion. And if the world's 1.7 billion women of reproductive age, and that's in developed as well as developing countries, where I think this issue is equally important in both, not just in the developing world, are going to have the capacity to time their own production, and they'll never come close to real equality with men until they're able to time their own reproduction. It will be because governments take seriously the need to make family planning services and commodities and reproductive health generally available to everybody who wants to use it, and invest accordingly. Now, if slowing population growth is among the motivations for people and their governments to make such investments, and if those investments succeed in slowing population growth, as they certainly have to date, then that's a good thing. So long as the actual reproductive timing decisions belong to individual women and men acting freely and in good health. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Matt. You've both given us quite a lot to chew on, and obviously just a glimpse of what is in the 2 books, so that, which I should hasten to add, that you're able to purchase out front before the reception that follows this discussion. As I asked you before, because we are webcasting this and then we'll have the video of this session archived online, I asked that as we move to the discussion that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone, let us know who you are. I think what we'll do is we'll collect a couple questions and then let Bob and Matt answer them as a group, and then collect some more. So who would like to kick us off? Yeah. Okay, gentleman down here, Rachel, right down here in the front.
Nick Everstadt, American Enterprise Institute. Bob and Matt, excellent presentations. I'd like to ask you both to speculate about something we can't possibly know the answer to yet, which is the future of voluntary childlessness in the world. As you know now, in places like German-speaking Europe, in German Switzerland, Austria, Germany itself, we seem to be seeing what's possibly the emergence of a new trend, but may not be, with 30% or more of women approaching the end of their childbearing years with no children. Do you gentlemen see the imperative for having children as a sort of a socio-biological drive in humanity, or is it something more like a muscle that gets trained and augmented through social constructs?
I guess I could begin. I'm going to leave it to Bob to answer the second part of that. But because, he's the one, after all, who was showing us pictures from Grey's Anatomy, right? I know it wasn't Grey's Anatomy, but I feel like he may be in a better position to talk about muscles and reflexes. But in that deep history. But in my case, when I look at more contemporary history, for historians, contemporary history is, like the last 100 years. I look to the decline in fertility rates and the response of certain governments with a great deal of concern, because if you look back to earlier periods, such as the 1920s and 30s, when governments were concerned about population decline, and mind you, in the Great Depression, even the United States was projected to have absolute declines in population. Many of them were tempted to implement increasingly coercive policies to try to boost fertility. In France, for instance, beginning in the Third Republic, but intensifying during the Vichy period, they began to persecute people even for voicing the opinion that it was acceptable for people to control their own fertility, and eventually abortionists were sent to hard labor and the guillotine. And there were competitive pronatalist policies all across Europe and Japan as well. I was astonished when I was working in the Italian archives to read how Mussolini was tracking birth statistics month by month, province by province, and keeping count of whether Italy was keeping up with Nazi Germany or falling behind the Soviet Union. In Italy, they decided to tax celibate men. Now that's why I think that when people make an argument about how it is that we can, and there's nothing wrong, with looking at making the argument for that providing contraception and abortion, there's nothing wrong with presenting it as a means to an end, to win over those who are really concerned about population trends. Well, again, on what basis then do you oppose those who would withdraw access to contraception and abortion, or do the one thing that we actually know works? Because economists don't know where babies come from. There's no good theory to explain, much less predict fertility. All they have are correlations. And as I tried to show, the strongest correlation is access to education. So if you promote access to education for girls as a way of reducing fertility rates, again, on what basis then can you stop governments that might be tempted to block access to education or careers to women to try to boost fertility rates? So looking at that more contemporary history, I have some real concerns about the future, and that's one of the arguments that I try to make with this book.
So what were my choices again? A muscle or what?
Reflex.
Imperative or training?
Right, okay. First of all, thanks a lot for coming, Nick. Nick and I go way back. We talked about this topic, I think probably a good 10 years ago at a panel. And actually, I'm glad you're here because I've been wanting to say something to you about this exact topic. And I'll try to use this answer to actually raise this point with you, because you've written about this compellingly, and particularly about the idea that when fertility gets especially low, we're going to be losing access to cousins and uncles and aunts and things of that kind. And the wonderful thing about childlessness too, I suppose, childlessness, voluntary childlessness, I want to stress that, is that it opens up all kinds of room for diversity in family sizes while keeping average fertility quite low. It's a point that I make in the book, that there's this tendency to think that if you've got a hyper-low fertility society, like some in Europe, like Italy and Spain, where for a while their European fertility is rising, and particularly those countries are rising, so they no longer are quite so low. But say you've got fertility of 1.1, which is about as low as fertility has ever gone in recorded times in a full country. So the thinking is that, wow, everybody's going around, women all have 1.1, or more realistically, one child. And poor one child, if we keep doing that, they'll never have an aunt or an uncle or cousin or whatever. And as a parent of a singleton who has a lot of cousins, I was very interested in that whole issue. But the reality is, because so many women are not having children in some societies, particularly in Europe, as Nick points out, actually the total fertility rate is the average of all women. But if you just look at the total fertility rate of those mothers, the fertility rate goes much closer to 2. Almost everywhere. That is, mothers' total fertility rates all around the world, well, all around the developed world, are much, much closer to 2, and in some cases 2 or over 2, which is just nice to know that the average kid, in fact, does have probably a sibling, and certainly is likely to have cousins or aunts or uncles. That said, my overall view, and what I write in the book, is sort of to celebrate the wisdom and the instinctual good sense of women and mothers throughout history, that we're not likely to go extinct. We've been around, a lot of species have been around longer. The German cockroach, a couple 100 million years. Human beings, just 200,000 years. So you could say, well, we're still kind of babies in the wood as far as species is concerned, but 200,000 years is a long time. We had a bottleneck around 70,000 years ago where apparently world population reached about 10 to 15, maybe 20,000 people. We survived that. We spread all around the world. None of these things seem to me changeless. And on that basis, I just think, yes, I don't know whether it's a muscle or reflex or imperative or what, but women will have children. There's just no doubt in my own mind. And one of the aspects of hyper-low fertility that people don't think about when they think, people talk about the fertility trap. There's this demographer, a few demographers that say, when fertility gets below 1.5 children per woman, you get into this fertility trap and it's never going to rise again. It's this scary idea that, yeah, women learn how much they can do with only 1.5 children. But that's crazy. In fact, almost all the societies that have 1.5 total fertility rates don't have any decline in population density. Housing is still just as difficult to find as it's ever been, because most of these societies, as a result of population momentum and immigration, are in fact still having rising density. Let it, or at least stable, let it last so long, and it may eventually, that population totals and density start to decline. Apartments get cheaper, land gets more available, jobs are available for people in their prime earning years, women are fully participating in the labor force. If that demographic change happens, then I suspect, I can't be sure and I'm not going to insist, but I suspect fertility would then begin to rise.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned immigration, Bob, because I was going to say we haven't heard the word migration, and it strikes me as perhaps a whole other discussion that we could have when focusing on this childlessness question, but perhaps if the opportunity arises, you could address how there are lots of people, it's just in some of these places particularly, they're not well integrated, or the different populations, and you actually have quite differential population growth rates within societies. And so strikes me as something about these social norms that might be able to change about integration of different communities that might make some of these absolute numbers on declining populations look a little different. Do we have some more questions from the audience? Link Day? Link, I'm not sure if the mic is on. On the bottom, you might have to flip the switch. On the very bottom, underneath. Go ahead and try it again.
I was going to confess to only one thing. I'm now going to confess to two. I'm a Luddite. The other thing that I'm going to confess to is that I'm an only child. And most of my best friends in school, in grade school, and in college were only children. And I think that I don't want to make the only child approach to peace, but I think an only child, if he's going to have any friends, is going to have to get along with a variety of people. He doesn't have any sibling on whom he has an emotional call for attention or generosity or anything of the sort. And he ends up being in a lot of different households. As I look back in my childhood growing up in Denver, I knew about the families of the mothers of my friends, the fathers, sometimes the grandparents. I knew about them. And I'm not sure that this is an experience that people with a lot of siblings necessarily have. Now, the question I have, though, is that I haven't heard anybody talk about optimum population. Some years ago, in fact, I think it was about 38 years ago, I wrote an article on the demographic optimum population. What would really be the ideal population, ultimately speaking? I'm not talking about what would be optimum in order to have the biggest army or the fastest growing depletion of the world's resources or whatever, just what would be the best. And it seemed to me that one of them would be a low level of mortality. You don't want children, mothers, so on, dying very early. Second, that's just a good. The second one would be an unchanging age and sex distribution. In other words, a situation where you are free of these great gaps and peaks and so on, coming into the labor force at unequal times, coming into schools, so on. And that the third, whatever the level, would be a zero growth rate. What do you have about optimum population?
A lot of the people I write about were very concerned about optimum population, but when you got them together in a room, they could never agree on what the optimum population should be. And, for instance, people were talking in 1952, how the United States had reached and even exceeded its optimum population. You can find people in that was the meeting that led to the establishment of the Population Council, where this was a very hot topic. And you can find the same thing, whenever people who were concerned about population growth's impact on the environment were involved in the discussion. Now, the difficulty, though, is it really does come down to how you understand the good life, what kind of lives people are going to be leading in a society, and that's something that tends to change over time. And if you think, for instance, that a society is overpopulated, then the question is, well, who exactly are you thinking of? I mean, are there certain people who shouldn't be there? I mean, are there particular kinds of people who we'd wish were not there? And in many cases, this discussion about quality of life ended up becoming a discussion about the quality of lives, the kinds of people who were reproducing, at a seemingly anarchic in an anarchic fashion. But the problem I have with optimum population, even if we could decide what we thought the optimum population should be, we wouldn't know how to achieve an optimum population. That's something that Bob and I agree on. Populations are always out of control. That line, it's not just a one-liner, at least I don't think it is, about how economists don't have a good theory for fertility. It has important policy implications. If you don't know where babies come from, then you can't devise policies and programs to shape fertility rates in any predictable fashion. And when you try to manipulate incentives, disincentives, as the people I write about did, with the idea of achieving specific population outcomes, it often has very pernicious consequences. So my argument in this book is that we should provide people with access to quality reproductive health care, contraception, abortion, and infertility treatment, among other things, because it's the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do, not because we think we're going to achieve a particular population outcome, because we won't. So that's my take on optimum population.
Well, I guess I could just speak really quickly and say this is one of these areas where Matt and I are in pretty firm agreement. But I have to say that I think reasonable people can disagree on this, and some of the people in population whom I most admire, including Lincoln Day, do talk about optimum population. and worry about it and try to imagine what it might be or what it might look like. I actually like the kind of indicators you're thinking about, like in terms of thinking what might be the characteristics of optimum population. I didn't use the term in my book, and I even really address it, mostly because, I have the same question, sort of, okay, optimum population, what then? It just does seem to me it brings us back to what I think really was a not great period of the movement, where it was really trying to get to some particular target population. And because I do say in the last chapter, I worry because frankly I am a little bit pessimistic about population. I think we're probably not at an optimum population right now. And one of my concerns is that if we could ever figure out what the optimum population is, that it would be way below our present population. I mean, way below. And that worries me immensely because there's not much we can do if that is the case. So I prefer to say, look, we've got 6.7 billion people. We're probably going to have a fair number more. We need to work kind of in every area on everything, environmentally, socially, in terms of justice, in terms of equity. Population is just one important sphere of the human endeavor, and we certainly ought to be looking for those sort of win-win propositions, and I see international family planning as among the most beautiful of those, where simply by providing women and men the capacity to do what they want to do, you will eventually have not just a stable population. Actually, you won't have a stable population for complex demographic reasons. What you'll have is a peaking population growth and then a declining population, which will head us more toward wherever that optimum is. But I don't want to aim for any particular place. I want to go where the women of the world would take us if they were each consciously choosing to have the Planned Parenthood slogan of every baby, every child, a wanted child. And Matthew argues in his book correctly that that's really not remotely feasible, and a lot of reasons there aren't. But I love that vision. And getting back to the issue of migration that Jeff raised, I think it's really interesting, and frankly it's also true of climate change and a lot of other things, that in the reproductive health and family planning field, we have a vision of how the world can get as a whole at least closer to, maybe not where it ought to be, but closer to, and I don't even want to say where it ought to be, I'm worried about Matt hearing that phrase, but a good place, let's say, by virtue of the collective wisdom of individual women and their partners. We don't have anything that resembles that in relation to migration. We don't have anything that yet resembles that. I hope we'll get there in relation to climate change. But we sure do in this field, and I think that's a wonderful thing about this field.
I have a question that comes, as some of you know, I've come out of spending a lot of time trying to understand different set of issues, environment's links to conflict. And so I was interested in how Matt was talking about the demographic links to conflict. And one of the things that some of us have fought against is a tendency, particularly some who try to write very popular books, including some of the people that you cited, a willingness to ascribe or oversubscribe causality to one variable. And that has been a concern. Now it's climate change seems to cause everything, including, the fact that my kids missed the bus this morning. But, so there's a danger that we all kind of can get excited for some of the right reasons about important problems, but oversell it, and it actually can be counterproductive. And so my question, Matt, is if I heard you right, I can completely agree with statements such as reducing population growth rate will not solve all environmental problems. I think absolutely. I think the question is, or the challenge is, to acknowledge that in terms of a kind of single causal variable explaining a problem, and if you address it, then it'll disappear. But a notion that, well, then how, it doesn't matter at all, and finding a fair bit of evidence to suggest that there are certainly linkages, and there can be positive and negative, and there are a lot of feedbacks, and it's highly complex. To me, I have this kind of big thing, institutions matter. There are all sorts of intervening kind of factors that control those relationships. So how in a sense, are you seeing, are there folks who are contextualizing, say, for example, in the pop and environment connection, that there are linkages, and in some ways, are there ways that people are treating these linkages as complex and part of a a whole big picture? Or do you see kind of no room for that more precise work, and that we're kind of all rushed, as, again, my kids all rushed to the soccer ball. We've all rushed to one issue and kind of oversold it and overstated it, have no room for alternative explanations, and therefore we need to throw it all out. How are you hearing that in reactions to what you're writing?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that, Jeff. Jeff and I first met each other because back when I was at the University of Michigan, he, together with some of the people there, helped to support the very earliest stage of this project. And I was drawn to it, as somebody who, was someone trained in diplomatic history, international history. I was drawn to it because I was interested in those kinds of links. Believe me when I say, that it was really only over the years, that I read and reflected on this some more, that I became increasingly wary about the way in which people can attribute, so much causal weight, to population growth. And I'm not the only one. I mean, it's something that I think you notice when you work in this field. There are a lot of people who are drawn to it with certain notions, things that they think are common sense, and then they come to appreciate that things are really more complicated and more interesting. I'm really glad, by the way, that we're having this discussion. Originally a lot of people were asking us, is this going to be a debate? And Bob and I, both of us agreed, having already been in debates, that really the best thing that we could do for us and for you, I hope as well, is to have this conversation. And I really appreciate the kind words that he started with about my book. In reading his book as well, I was impressed, how it is that, people working in this field come to realize that if you want to understand issues like political violence, that you owe it, to the people whose lives are most directly affected, to bring to it all the rigor, and all the evidence that you can, and treat those issues with the seriousness that they warrant. When I, for instance, was trying to point out the complexity of how it is that household dynamics might lead us to think differently about how reducing rates of growth can come about because of the reduction in size of households actually leads to an increase in the number of households, including in Italy, by the way. Mm-hmm. Actually, one reason housing is no easier now in Italy than it was before is because even as fertility rates decline, even as they reach a declining population, numbers of households continue to increase. So I'm not so sanguine about recovery and fertility rates if it's really about housing. But I was drawn to that research by Paul Ehrlich. I was doing an interview with Paul Ehrlich, and he started to talk about how it is, this household dynamics factor a lot of us never really considered. And I pointed out to him, really, that's interesting, because if you look at all the family planning posters and films and flip charts, it was always promoting the smaller family as the one surrounded by conspicuous consumption. So that, dynamic, household dynamics, is really quite critical, and it's something that puts this history in a different light than we would expect. But I think you do have to look at it from different angles. It's that complicated and it's that important. So again, I'm really appreciating the fact that we're able to have this conversation about it and not just debating it. So,
well, let's start a debate. I'm tired of being Mr. Nice Guy. I guess I'm struck by, well, thank you, Matt. I do appreciate that. We can talk about housing. Actually, I'll tell a little story about that in a second. Obviously, the world is multi-causal. One of my concerns about the presentation of the family planning movement is to try to indicate fairly and accurately, as well as possible, just to what extent were people exaggerating the importance of population growth, and to what extent were people thinking, look, this is something that at least is one of the big factors and it's something that can be addressed, so let's address it. And I'm not sure how to characterize that as accurately as possible. But I'm in the funny position, having written the book that I wrote, of becoming, if anything, more radical about the importance of population growth. And my wife can speak to this. I see it pretty much. I mean, I open up the paper and I go, population. And not just when I read Blaine Harden's articles about the Philippines, because I just see it as being so important in terms of setting the scale for things and then setting the nature, really not just the scale, but the nature of different kinds of human interactions in environment, socially, politically, all kinds of ways, to see how the emergence of early organized societies had to do with the fact that there were simply larger numbers of people to deal with was impressive to me, and to see what people are thinking about that. So on that score, I tend to see it is important, and often very important, in undercutting so many issues that I'm sympathetic to people who felt like if we could somehow address this one issue successfully, it would have just multiple benefits all over the place. And I frankly am a believer in that. I'm sure much more than many others. Security is one of those areas. I mean, my observation is not so much that everybody glommed. I mean, caveat emptor. I'm a co-author of the PAI publication, The Security Demographic, which I think helped promote the argument that particularly age structure was a major component in at least vulnerability to emerging civil conflict. So obviously, I'm going to defend that work to some degree. I think we presented it fairly in a balanced way, saying, look, we're not claiming this is the source of the problem. We're just saying there's some interesting correlations and some interesting arguments for why this ought to be considered and looked at more closely, that it may in fact make some already weak societies, Rwanda, clearly not Belgium, societies that are weak for other reasons, more vulnerable to conflict. And my observation is more, and it's just my bias. We all have our biases. There isn't any sort of one totally balanced way to look at these things. My bias is that for the most part, people are uncomfortable with that argument. I don't think so many people have glommed onto it that it's now just sort of the only argument going. I think if anything, for the most part, most population arguments don't tend to carry much weight because people are uncomfortable still with the issue and feel that they'll be seen as Malthusian if they buy the argument. So my sense is they get less legitimacy than they deserve. But, for example, on this consumption and household thing, I have to drop a couple of names here that some of you will know. I was at the Population Association of America conference in New Orleans that just finished on Saturday, and I was having dinner with two prominent men in this field, John Bongartz, Population Council senior demographer, and John Cleland of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and they were sort of quizzing me because they know I'm Mr. Pop Environment, and they were sort of saying, look, face it, Bob, consumption is going to be growing so much more than population that for you to be thinking about population growth as a component, and this is an argument that Matt makes, and I was relentlessly refusing to budge and saying consumption is limited, population is not, unless you believe in Malthus. In a non-Malthusian environment, population can grow endlessly. Any parents can have as many children as they want, and children, unlike houses, cars, all kinds of resource consumption, have offspring, and those offspring themselves multiply. So unless your goal is to keep everybody as poor as possible, consuming no natural resources, population can reach a point that resource use grows, whereas consumption is limited. They were going, consumption is not limited? Come on, people can do whatever they want. They can buy as much as they want. Well, yeah, but houses themselves don't have sex and have little houses. And even if you have more than one house, you only are going to be living in one at a time. You cannot drive more than one car at a time. It may be a Hummer, but after you've bought that Hummer and you're driving it, that's the limit to your consumption. So I actually don't agree with Matt's argument at all. Even if housing has expanded, and he's right about the Science article, that expansion is not sustainable. Ultimately, you get to a point, it may not be a good point, it may be a problem for the environment. We've got to address that too. And I work for a group that works on consumption. But it's not the same thing as population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we had a session here earlier this year with Brian O'Neill and some of the work in terms of that's underway but not yet finished in terms of the population climate change connection, which raised some of these scenarios that did have lower population outcomes, but still high levels of consumption, and then the other. So, but we'll have perhaps some more research that we can draw on. And I know, seeing Barbara here, Center for Global Development is tackling some of these issues as well. So it'll be terrific to see some of that research in the future. Matt, do you have any comments in response to Bob, or we can take another?
Well, it's really interesting for me to be on the side of John Cleland and Bongartz. If you were at the
this time only,
right? Maybe one time only. It's a one-time special. But no, I mean, I also think it's mainly about consumption. I mean, if you think that population is unlimited and consumption is limited, I mean there are all kinds of constraints, practically speaking, in terms of how people consume. For instance, one of the problems with a lot of the projections of the 1970s about how we were going to reach overshoot and collapse, about how it is we're going to exhaust all known oil reserves and so on. The work of the Club of Rome is that they didn't factor into the model the fact that should have been right before their eyes, which is that things get more expensive. When things become scarce, they become more expensive. And so, when, just as in the 1970s, people begin to realize how scarce and valuable, gas can be, big cars become unfashionable. I'm old enough to remember. So that's, one of the ways in which you can call it a constraint or you can call it, the price system, but it's one of the ways I think consumption comes to be regulated. But obviously, I mean, there are things that can be done through taxes and other things in order to try to remove, some of the perverse incentives that we have that have made, in some cases, things like food artificially expensive. And I'm thinking about biofuels, of course, and export, bans and tariffs and the rest of it. So.
I think perhaps folks are just waiting to get you guys one-on-one in this reception, and they're saving their ammunition, keeping their powder dry for some one-on-one conversations. We do, fortunately, have the opportunity to continue this conversation with the reception. Also online here at the Wilson Center, we'll have PowerPoints and summaries and links to the video. Urge all of you to share your thoughts on these issues in places like our blog, New Security Beat, where we will capture some of the voices and words of Matt and Bob and others of you who have weighed in on these topics over the years. But Bob and Matt, very best of luck. I'm sure that you will be willing to sign the books that people can get out front, and urge you all to join me in thanking Bob and Matt for today's discussion. Thank you. Thank you.